The Innovators Network.
Welcome to the Killer Innovation Show, the longest continuously produced podcast in history. Each week, Phil McKinney brings you the insights and strategies to amplify your creativity and innovation skills. Here's your host, Phil McKinney.
Welcome to this week's episode of Killer Innovations. Thank you for joining us here today. We have another great episode with an outside guest. I've reached out into my network of friends, people who I respect and who have a very broad set of perspectives in the area that they're focusing on. Today's guest is a gentleman by the name of Alan Proithis. He is the founder and CEO of Capstone Partners. Alan does a bunch of advisory work to venture capitalists, private equity firms, government agencies, particularly around mobile 5G. Alan and I met up when we were both working at Computer Sciences Corporation, CSC, back in the early to mid-90s, and actually worked together both at CSC. We worked together at HP. We stay in contact on a pretty regular basis and help each other out. If there's technical expertise or thoughts, Alan will reach out to me. If I need business development, business strategy, that's Alan. So we've kind of had this long-term relationship. Most recently, Alan has been spending a lot of time on next generation mobile technologies, 5G, etc. But yeah, we do talk in this episode a little bit about 5G and the technologies, but we quickly shift this into innovation and innovating on top of these kinds of infrastructures, these kinds of technologies. But more importantly is around collaboration. These kinds of technologies act as really enablers, and it's an opportunity for you as an innovator to innovate on top of these platforms. So that's one thing hopefully you get out of today's episode. But we talk about collaboration. We also talk about skill sets. What's really the right set of skill sets for people that want to be in the innovation game of how do you bring these technologies together? Because Alan has done everything from being in large corporate. He was the U.S. CEO for Sigfox, big player in the IoT space, and actually built the U.S. operation at Sigfox. So Alan comes from a startup to large corporate background and the soft skills. We talk a lot about the soft skills. And I asked Alan my standard question about what technology, what innovation is he most excited about that he thinks you should keep an eye on. So you want to stay to the end to find out what Alan's answer for that is. So before we jump into this week's episode, again, I want to thank you for the time of joining us here today, but I also have that favor to ask. So follow, like, and share. Follow us on social media, like this episode, and share it with your contacts, people who you think might benefit from hearing today's episode, this interview discussion with Alan Proithis at Capstone Partners. And with that, let's jump in to this week's episode.
This episode is sponsored by Zoom. With Zoom, you can streamline your communication, collaboration, and creativity all in one place. Zoom is the market-leading platform that provides video meetings, voice, webinars, and chat across desktops, phones, tablets, and conference room systems. To learn more about Zoom and sign up for your free account, visit killerinnovations.com/Zoom.
Well, Alan, it's been a long time since you and I have had a chance to get together. We were planning to get together at CES, but CES was not going to happen this year with everything going on. But the last time you and I were talking, we talked a lot about the variety and range of companies that are reaching out to you. There's just a lot going on. And I was interested in having you come on the show because your perspective and what you're seeing kind of in the front range as investments and monies are coming into mobile innovations, I thought it would be an interesting conversation and something that the listeners would enjoy. So what have you been up to And where do we start this conversation off at?
Well, thanks, Phil, for having me on the show. It's always great to connect, and I'm glad we could break through plague and fire I'm just waiting for the locusts to descend upon the technology industry at this point, because that's about the only thing left of biblical nature affecting us. But in any case, no, it's a wonderful time to be in tech, and especially anything that touches the mobile space. I think we continue to see an unprecedented amount of investment and interest. I think that the COVID situation has accelerated pretty much every trend we've been talking about for the last decade or two has really been put on steroids, as a result of all the crazy things in the last 2 years. And I come at it from a perspective as a person who's been in the mobile industry really, as I joke, since we had cans with strings connecting us, and as a person who is really involved in lots of advisory work with different types of companies with a connected technology thread, including a bunch of board and private equity work, and even getting into some solution delivery where there's been some gaps for people trying to take advantage of the latest in private network trends. So my perspective is unlike my old perspective when I was in the corporate world with you. My current perspective is a person who's really touching and seeing many different perspectives from around the U.S. and Europe.
Well, and for the listeners, Alan and I have been together at different companies. From the mid-90s?
Yes, believe it or not, Phil, I still remember celebrating the launch of the first GSM mobile network in this country when my wife was pregnant, 8 months pregnant with our now 25-year-old daughter.
Oh,
man. So that's how long we go back.
Yeah, the launch of OmniPoint, which was the first GSM operator in the U.S., which became T-Mobile. That was
Exactly.
That was market one for the T-Mobile network in the U.S. that we built, and then Tavern on the Green, right in the middle of winter, if I remember.
It was it was in the beginning of winter, and but it was lovely, and I'm glad no one gave birth in Central Park.
So Alan and I've been together. Alan also, we worked together at HP on the mobile platform. Alan, you were part of the handset business, or part of the integration of the iPac line and Palm acquisitions and all the other attempts to try to get into the mobile space, right? And there's been a lot of plays in this area, and I know that you're spending, or had spent a lot of time. You were at Sigfox for a while, which was an early provider coming from Europe to look at kind of IoT-specific kinds of network plays. And then most recently, you've been doing private 5G. So, I mean, the whole mobile space and the keeping broadband up and running anywhere and everywhere for not just voice traffic or, checking your Facebook page, but the application breadth on this thing now is just, exploding.
Yeah, I mean, there's really no limit. And as the founding president of Sigfox North America was really trying to figure out how to connect those billions of things with a non-cellular technology, because cellular technology is spectacular. But if we think about why they were invented for people to talk to each other wirelessly, even though people don't really do a whole lot of that anymore. And then they were optimized for really a whole different, we talk about innovation, and to me, innovation goes far beyond technology to business model. And if you look at all the systems and all the technologies behind the cellular companies that we love and work with for our careers, they're really optimized for a different world. And that was the whole premise of Sigfox. And I think the premise is still very valid. And I think it's being realized, though, by other non-cellular technologies like LoRa that are, long distance, really inexpensive, really long battery life, but have a set of systems behind them where you can actually provision and monitor a customer with a system that's built to manage someone with an ARPU of a couple bucks a year versus hundreds of dollars a year, and that's a whole different thing. But yeah, lately, as part of my advisory work, I've been spending a lot of time on private 5G networks because of what's been going on with things like CBRS in this country. both with the general availability of CBRS and also some of the priority license associated with it. And we're really seeing, I think, a renaissance in different things, in private networks and the applications that those networks enable.
Well, it's interesting. I was just having a conversation with some people at Vodafone Germany, and one of the projects that they've been touting is they've put in place a true private network for Porsche at the Porsche factory. And they literally are running every machine in the factory is running over this private 5G network. And now they're talking about doing it like chemical factories and all of this. So you kind of typically think of cellular as, okay, it's good. You know, there's this 4G view of, you know, drop calls, etc. 5G, though, people kind of have a different expectation, or, you know, there is this expectation that, hey, if I'm going to use it as a private network, and in some cases, in fact, I just had a call this morning with somebody on healthcare, you know, critical monitoring of home health devices and, you know, what network is the best thing to do it for. There's some pretty wacky applications out there that people are thinking about that, you know, years ago, you and I, someone came to us back in the, I'll really age myself. Go back to CDPD, early data on cellular on the old
IC94, Phil. I still remember it well.
Yeah.
I was involved in the billing systems involved in the early cellular data stuff.
Right. So CDPD was data back in the early days of mobile, which now everybody just comes on your phone with your browsers and off you go. But, you know, if you thought about some of these applications back then, you'd be like, are you nuts? You know, no way. And now, you know, the 5G industry has been, you know, the big thing is remote, you know, operation, remote surgeries is one of the use cases out there. But is it really as universal as people try to make it out to be, or is there still better use cases to really take advantage of it?
So I think a couple of points about that. I mean, first of all, I think there's been so much consumer marketing around so-called 5G, which I think has really created a lot of misperceptions, because 5G, first of all, is such a spectrally efficient technology. When you can put thousands of more calls or connections in the same spectrum as you could with even 4G, you know, it's basically a really good idea for the operators to get everybody on 5G as soon as possible. From a consumer standpoint, though, you may see your battery die faster, but in the short term, you're really not going to get a lot of benefit out of it, which is why we see private 5G networks going up, because there's a huge benefit potentially for enterprises embracing it. And I think of 5G like you would a private road. Think about the way public networks are defined. If it's public, it has to be suitable for everybody. That's from the high school kid who's on TikTok nonstop to the corporate entity who's trying to do video conferencing or some other things. And so it's not optimized for any one thing. It's really built to be usable by everyone, but not optimized for a specific thing. When you get to private networks, so the first thing I'll call out, which sounds really crazy, but you get to put it where you want it. And the thing about 5G and the spectrum that's used for it, whether it's mid-band or millimeter wave spectrum, is that, first of all, it doesn't even really go inside very well. In fact, there's been studies done, I think Verizon published one last year, that in Manhattan, you get a better signal in front of a brick wall than a window with 5G, because the E-coding they put on, the emissivity coatings they put on for energy efficiency, well, what are radio signals? They're energy. And so it actually, that's why you're seeing an explosion in people who provide indoor coverage for 5G, because you really need a dedicated infrastructure for that. But more important, so first of all, you get to put 5G exactly where you need connectivity, and you get to put it in an incredibly secure and optimized way. And now without totally geeking out, and I'm not on, thank goodness, on any standards committees, because I'd only be good for dinner conversation on those at 3GPP. But with the latest 3GPP releases, and to be able to do the things we've been talking about for years, like taking a virtual slice of the network and saying, we're optimizing this slice for that remote surgery you want. We're optimizing this slice for these production machines, for telemetry. We're optimizing this slice for controlling all the automated robots in the warehouse. being able to dynamically allocate and reallocate based on policy, for instance, very well-defined policy, is really a concept that goes orders of magnitude beyond what we have with a public network. So we still need public networks. Public networks are awesome. They have their place even with 5G. But you bring in this entirely new dynamic when you can now tune virtual slices of a private network to do exactly what you want, when you want, where you want, on demand.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting. It almost becomes almost a tool for innovators to think about, right? Because now the application developers are thinking about, okay, if I've got that ability to slice a network, to optimize it, versus I just kind of have to fit into a big pipe, but I can create now a pipe that's actually tailored to the application, big payloads, little payloads, quality of service, security end to end. If I've got to be HIPAA compliant in the US, if I'm carrying healthcare information, I can tailor that slice specifically to it. So as an innovator, and audience for this show are people who are trying to create that next great idea that's going to be transformative. I would say that 5G is one of those infrastructure plays that innovators need to think beyond just simply it's a pipe, but that you can actually create a pipe that really becomes optimized for whatever that idea, whatever that innovation is. And you just recently, though, did an interesting private 5G activity with the government, right? Which is kind of a very unique case of innovating on creating a platform that allows for Department of Defense to do some unique things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We keep hearing about the battle to win the 5G battle, and if you think about the attributes of a 5G network, of put it where you want it, super secure, and optimize it for the applications, well, that really fits a lot of the needs of government, especially when you talk about the Pentagon and military applications. And so I was, my firm Capstone Partners was fortunate enough to become part of a team that won one of the very first 5G projects and actually delivered the first ever private 5G network for the Department of Defense. And it was for a Marine Corps warehouse in Albany, Georgia. Really nice people, about 3 hours south of Atlanta. And where about 25% of all Marine Corps stuff goes through at some point. And it's almost like Raiders of the Lost Ark in the warehouse scene at the end, where you stand outside this warehouse and you look to your left and you look to your right, and you cannot see the end of the warehouse. It's that big. And up until not a lot of years ago, because government tends to lag a bit, they were actually running this on paper. Okay, it sounds crazy, but they've really embraced and through consortiums like the National Spectrum Consortium have done a great job of trying to facilitate getting closer to industry to adopt some and really leapfrog ahead with these new technologies. And so as part of a winning team led by Convida Wireless, which is the leading spectrum access software provider, if you're familiar with what's going on with CBRS and the 150 megahertz of midband spectrum we have that's shared that anybody can use, as long as you play by the rules, just like Wi-Fi spectrum. And some other great partners like JMA Wireless, which is the leading US supplier of 5G RAN, Cisco, and some other great people. We were able to deliver very early the demo and then the delivery of the actual site before the holidays of this network. And so a couple of the demonstration applications on the testbed we put in was how do you run IoT? How do you increase awareness of your entire operation? From knowing if a door is open a couple million square feet away to even monitoring the CO2 levels as a proxy for air freshness or as someone letting a bunch of tractor trailers blow fumes in a place. But you can imagine all the sensitive products, whether it's managing the lifespans of MREs or other temperature and humidity sensitive products. And then the other interesting thing we did there that was really unique was an edge application with a Capstone partner called Icon that has a holographic technology that does not need goggles. Goggles are great, but they only last for so long typically because of the battery life and other things. And this is an accessory that goes on any smartphone that uses a smartphone to connect to the network. And we were using a combination of mid-band and millimeter wave. And it was an application running on an edge server. So you can now navigate around this 3 million square foot warehouse. And when you found the thing you're looking for, because it was like the other, million square boxes, brown boxes in the place, you could actually scan it and using that 5G network instantly pull up a visual of the contents of that box to really drive the error rate down and increase efficiency. So this is just the first phase of the project, but nothing like this has ever been done. And it's led to a lot of interesting conversations of what could happen as part of expanding this 5G infrastructure.
So in this case, it was a private 5G. You weren't using the public 5G. This was a private 5G network for this warehouse?
Completely private 5G network running in mid-band and millimeter wave.
Yeah. Wow. And what's the, what was the learnings? I mean, obviously, this is also a great role for government to encourage innovation, right? Create these test beds to kind of put a gating factor and force people to work together to solve a problem. But obviously, at the other end of this is what's the lesson learned? What do you take away from that both maybe multiple phases on that project, but also bring out to the commercial world?
I think there's a couple. I think, first of all, it's important to note this is an ORAN project. And so we talk a lot about ORAN and getting away from, non-proprietary stuff. And I think, first of all, the takeaway is ORAN works. It's working every day down there. So that's the good news. I think the other thing, though, is there's a lot of integration points because it's still early days. And I think having a team that's incredibly collaborative is essential to any success. Luckily, this team was one of the most collaborative I've ever seen. And if they weren't, this thing, frankly, wouldn't have been delivered. Because this was awarded at the same time of a number of other projects, and we got this done way, way ahead of time, actually. And then the final thing I would add, and this is part of my personal bias as a person who does a lot of innovation work, is that you need to have the end application in mind. I mean, you put in one of these networks and you stand around saying, hey, do you like the tingle? Does it feel good? The network has to have a purpose,
right?
And it needs to be sort of tightly connected to that purpose. And I think the other reason this was effective was there's a clear end results we were trying to achieve in terms of the applications we just deployed and some other ones that will be deployed in the coming year.
Well, it's interesting you were talking about the specifically around the role of collaboration, right? I mean, and you and I have had this conversation in our in other times we've talked, right? The pace of innovation, the cost to innovate is accelerating. It's more expensive to try to stitch all these pieces together. The complexity of innovation is also increasing. So the days of where people used to think they could even do it on their own, even large organizations, like you and I were at HP together, we were at Computer Sciences Corporation together, you even look at Microsoft or Google, no one entity anymore can do it all together. You have to you got to kind of get over yourself and realize that you've got to collaborate. You've got to find that ability and the right set of partners, which I think, you were emphasizing, which I think is absolutely critical. You can't collaborate with everybody because some people just are not as collaborative or culture's different or whatever the reason might be. Finding the right set of partners, but innovating without collaboration is doomed for failure, right?
Yeah, you're done. It's sort of like in fourth grade, the kids you get that don't play well with others, you don't want on the project. Because, and that's one of the things I've commented on having, my wife and I having children that are young adults that are just in their first few years in their professional careers. One of the things I've always emphasized to them is that every year that goes by, while you need certain specific skill sets, it's actually the soft skills become more important. And I think the acceleration of that into earlier career, because I used to think it's more tied to as you sort of get more responsibility, especially when you get on the C-level. It's amazing how important the soft skills are. And to your point, Phil, I would say that the importance of those soft skills consistently is pushed down earlier and earlier career because of the pace of innovation. And it's really the only way things get done is that ability to play well with others.
Right. Yeah, we've all had the experience of trying to collaborate with people who just don't understand how to structure collaborations around complex innovation efforts, right?
Mhm.
And how many partners did you have on this warehouse? You had, it was Federated, it was
Well,
Capstone.
Federated, JMA Wireless, Cisco were the key ones, but there were a whole variety of some smaller ones as well. And let's not forget about our Navy customer. It was sponsored by, because of course Marine Corps Warehouse was sponsored by, it's called NIWIC is the abbreviation, which frankly are just as important, in fact critical to this whole project, where they may not have had the deep technical expertise, but they understood the importance of working together.
Right,
And so I think if they weren't equally collaborative, this thing wouldn't have happened either.
right.
So it really did take everybody just sort of putting aside the ego and let's just be focused on what we're trying to achieve. And we all know we're on piece. And then you find the cracks and the gaps and the overlaps and you work through them.
Right. Yeah. And that yeah, I don't think I wasn't quite anticipating us getting into a collaboration discussion, but it's one that keeps coming up. When I get these phone calls from, CEOs trying to bring new innovations to the marketplace, and they haven't worked. They don't have the soft skills. They don't have the network of relationships. They haven't built that trust with players that are going to be critical for the success of any innovation effort, right? Talk about Vodafone Germany and Porsche. They've had a long relationship that goes back decades, even before Vodafone existed, when it was Monosman that built the original network that became Vodafone. It is, it is those relationships. It is that trust. It is that ability to collaborate that is just so important. I think people underestimate its role in innovation.
Yeah. And I would actually go so far to extend the concept of collaboration. Actually, I put ecosystem in that.
Right.
Because ecosystem is about collaboration. It's not just a bunch of logos on a website, as beautiful as they may look. And this is, at Sigfox, we built from nothing to covering 7 million people with a wireless network, but also we hosted the global ecosystem team here in the US. So I built most of that team. And from the hypercloud to an SI to a semiconductor level. And there's a lot of the code. And I just had a call with an operating partner from the VC about just this morning before we talked about this. And one of the things I stress is because you can't do everything. You need to have, right. And the lines may change, but you need to really understand where do you add value versus the partners you need around you, and then build your ecosystem around you, because it really reduces the time and the cost of sale for everybody. And that line may move over time, and that's okay if you're transparent. But if you're not thinking about ecosystem with any company in today's world, it's just going to be really hard to succeed. Right. There's just too much to do.
Yeah, the days of being fully vertically integrated is really, really hard, and very few companies achieve long-term success. They may achieve short-term, success from the standpoint of making some progress, but it's not a long-term viable, at least not in my opinion, on disruptive, big change, big shifts occurring. Mm-hmm. Focusing on trying to be completely vertically integrated is not an innovation strategy that I would recommend people focus on. Finding the best partner. Back in the days at CSC, you and I used to always get into this about, do you do a complete monolithic stack of software, or do you find, best of breed for the functionality you need, right?
Yeah.
And back then it was really hard to integrate, but it's gotten much easier. But when it comes to any kind of innovation, that becomes really a critical element.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a business model thing too, right? I mean, I read something recently, like 2/3 of the stuff you buy on Amazon are actually a third party. So I mean, we're talking about this like you're 3 guys and a dog in a garage somewhere, but it's up and down the stack, the industry, and and the trick is to evolve, what that ecosystem looks like as you grow and add skill areas as well.
Right, it is. It's interesting you bring up the Amazon thing, right? Because, like nowadays, you go back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you didn't have access to supply chain, and you didn't have access to low-cost manufacturing like you have now, to where anybody, even, some college kid in a dorm room can go online and search and find some thing being manufactured by somebody in the world, and then go online and create a website and sell the heck out of it, and create a business with little to no upfront capital, in the whole process. So the constraints that used to be there to take an idea and deliver it is different now on the simple stuff. Highly integrated, complex things. That's where scale, brings an advantage. But the ability to reach out and have, just recently for the holidays, I bought my grandson a Glowforge, right? So it's a laser cutter, laser etcher, right? This thing is bigger than he is, and he's 8, right? He's already he got it at Christmas. I did a little blog post or a social media post on him the other day because he and I were off shopping for supplies. This kid is like cutting up stuff like you wouldn't believe, right? He's 8 years old and he's now getting orders. People are sending him orders to manufacture stuff off of his Glowforge Plus, to do custom build stuff. I'm like, he's 8.
Phil, you know what that is, Phil? It's the old New Yorker cartoon. On the internet, no one knows you're a dog.
Exactly.
Well, on the internet, no one knows you're an 8-year-old with a laser cutter.
With a laser cutter, and he does, I mean, this kid is like in his element. I mean, I think we have created a monster with this kid. But it just goes to show that the cost of these things have reduced, but the ability to have that reach goes up. But as you go now the challenge isn't so much the manufacturing, it is really understanding the problem you're trying to solve. Like you said about the warehouse, the partner, the Marine Corps team that's actually depending on this application, the team understanding their problem and solving their problem. And what I have found, and I don't know if you experienced this with this project, or some of your other projects, right? It's a lot harder to truly understand the problem than most people think. People think they get the superficial, like, oh, I get it. No. The subtlety of the problem is a lot harder to really suss out than you think.
Oh, it's painful. And I've implemented like lean startup methodology at different levels in more companies than I can count now for that reason. And the methodology to me is secondary than getting that depth of customer understanding. Because to your point, people will say, oh, yeah, I understand the customer. And then you ask them, well, when was the last time you actually were at their site? I mean, there was a company I dealt with a few years ago that was doing something in the ag business. And I started asking them questions. And after about half an hour, I found out there's no one in the company had ever been on a farm, actually. And they were trying to sell into that market. And I'm like, okay, I think we're done here. And,
yep.
You have to get your hands dirty. You have to get in the field. And you got to feel the pain. You got to feel the pain of the problem. Or you're never going to understand it to the depth that you need to really, help them and succeed along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting because the people do a lot of hand waving. Well, I read this research study, or this, I did a survey, or I did a focus group, right? And actually, there's people that are on my team at Cable Labs that very well from our HP days together. And this person, Mickey and I always go butt heads because she's a big, she does a lot of the market studies and, discerning unmet needs, those types. That's kind of her background. But she's a big believer in focus groups. And I'm always the one that's kind of like, I hate focus groups. They're just not, I can't get my head wrapped around that you're going to get good insight. But she's proved me wrong a few times. And I've proved her, that I've been right a few times. But you're right. You got to get out there and you got to be willing to engage. If you're going to solve a problem with whatever it is, 5G networks or innovating, or, my grandson with his Glowforge now starting his own little business as an 8, 9-year-old. Understanding the customer and understanding what their needs are and understanding, what the real problem is, not the superficial. Because in many cases, the customer is not very good at describing the problem. You actually have to help them discover the problem.
Yeah, like we all know, remember when the iPhone came out, and we all were interested because it's Apple. You got to take it seriously at some level, but we all were sort of like what do these guys know about phones? They got like, 5% market share on the, laptop market. And none of the technologies they put in there, that first phone, were really anything new. But it was the way that they integrated them and created a customer experience that was the innovation.
Right. Exactly.
And they made it so easy to consume their product. Really, even what amazes me about today's world in technology is that any enterprise application is expected to look like the best consumer experience that the user's ever had. The innovation is often not, business model and just the whole, touch point on the customer of how they engage with it.
Yep. Well, it is. It creates an expectation that if you fall short of, you get pushed aside, right? It's a tough bar to hit, right? Trying to recreate that experience. And one of the credits I always give to Apple, and you and I both know Andy Grignon. He was one of the original 6 engineers on the original iPhone project, and would get the 2 a.m. phone calls from Steve Jobs when the phone would hang or whatever. But, Andy would always share this story, right? That they had the fundamental design work done for 2 years, and they sat and waited because they knew they needed another round of silicon, Moore's Law, to improve the silicon. They wanted another generation of touchscreen to improve the response, and they were patient. Everybody else would have just hurried up, packaged up, and said, "Oh, it's good enough. Get it out there. That'll be the second generation." No, they had a bar that they wanted to hit in that first generation, and they were willing to sit on it for 2 years. And that patience is so rare in the technology world or the broader innovation world. Everybody's about get it out there. And Steve and that team said, no. We have a certain expectation of what we're going to deliver, and we're not ready. We've got everything worked out, but we need another cycle of another generation of improvement to deliver what we think is the minimally accepted experience.
Yeah, patience and massive cash flow, Phil. So it's amazing how cash flow funds patience. But
It does.
But to that point, though, if it was a startup company that was under cash flow constraints and a certain burn rate and a fume date, they could not have waited, and they probably would have blown up along the way of doing that project. And that's why it's really sad that I think big companies have outsourced so much of their innovation, and then just try to acquire it later. A little bit of partnering, but acquire it. And I think it's sad because, to your point, this wouldn't have happened with a startup very easily.
Well, and I've talked on a previous show not too long ago about, innovation by acquisition is not an invalid strategy, right? Because you can't invent everything inside of an organization. But when you go and where 95% of your innovations by acquisition, and you're not funding any of your own innovation work, then what have you become, right? And if you look particularly in Silicon Valley, whether it be IBM and IBM Research or HP Labs or Xerox PARC or what you typically think, or even Bell Labs, you think of the old corporate research that became really the catalyst for a lot of the innovations. Look, laser printers, inkjet printing. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of the early work of LED lighting was done at HP Labs, right?
Sure.
You don't get credit for that. Consumer GPS was actually developed at HP, and that team left HP and started, shipping that product, more broadly. You don't have that catalyst anymore. You look at IBM Research, HP Lab, Xerox PARC, Bell Lab. They are a fraction of what they used to be. You look at government DARPA funding. It is way down from what it used to be, right? Those big catalysts that could afford to take big risks because they had cash flow and scale and they could fund patients doesn't exist anymore, right? And I think we're going to, and my prediction is we're going to suffer, and we have suffered, because what happens then is those that are willing to fund that, which maybe other countries, it may be other entities, are going to get that advantage.
Yeah, the one bright spot I would say is that we have a capitalistic system in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
and to some extent Europe now too, and Canada, that we have an excess of cash looking for investments.
Yep.
And so you're getting ideas funded now that probably are getting a level of scrutiny below of anything we've seen in the last 10 years. And so you do see some of the experiments, but to your point, you can't always wait 3-4 years to see if the experiment is successful. There's probably a much more of a drumbeat of, hey, this thing has to make some cash sooner.
Yep.
But I think because of the excess of cash in the market now, you are seeing things get funded that normally wouldn't. That's a lot will burn up, but there'll be some winners. But the question becomes, to your point, what happens when the interest rates go up X amount of times this year, and that spigot gets turned off sometime later in the year? And then what does the innovation market look like in 2023 and forward for a few years? So it's an interesting concern.
Well, it is, and I think there's things that happen. You talk about the fact that the bar for scrutiny is maybe a little bit lower because there's just so much money sloshing around in the system right now. But at the same time, though, there's been some things that have happened that I think have turned off some investors from taking longer bets. Take Theranos as an example, right? Talk about, a unethical innovation effort. And I think it's turning off because, look, Theranos was going to be a long bet. People knew it was going to be a long bet. The amount of money raised was insane on the Theranos bet, right? And people are saying, something, we know this is going to be a long bet, but it could be transformative. But it was the whole thing behind it, the ethics of misleading investors and all of those kinds of things. Now people are now suspecting anything that takes long term. I'm not going to dig in on it. I don't have the expertise to understand it. I don't, I want something that's going to give me the quicker return, right? And then some of the motivations. The motivation of a VC is different than private equity versus an angel investor versus corporate, corporate VCs. All of those things, right? And I think, I'm hoping some rationalization comes out of this, and that we get some form of a different level of staging. That long, deeper range investments come back where we can take longer bets. I just don't see. I see that that's one segment of innovation that I'm concerned about. That's drying up. Mm-hmm. That we're going to have a big impact on.
Well, I'll leave you with what I think is the canary in the coal mine for that comment, Phil. Theranos is a big hot mess, and I think a warning to all of us. But let's just look at semiconductors. I mean, look at the component shortages we've had, and you have, and a good friend of mine in Silicon Valley he's a CFO and probably the most expert analyst in the semiconductor market, Jay Goldberg, will tell you that, and he's a great blog called Digits for Dollars, and he'll tell you there's maybe a half dozen firms that would even invest in semiconductors today. And here we are every day talking about component shortages, geopolitical risk with everything being manufactured in Asia. And there's a half dozen guys willing to invest in semiconductors because it's a bet of billions, tens of billions of dollars. You don't see the return for years. It's exactly what you're talking about. But, you're starting to see a change now with some of the latest announcements, but it's a great example of what you're talking about.
Well, and I think, the other example of that is, look, the government, U.S. government, gave Intel $30 billion to invest in the Arizona, right? So I think also government's willing to maybe not fund like the old, the big things in DARPA, albeit DARPA is still great and it still does a lot of exciting work. I think the ability for public-private partnerships is where part of this gets addressed, right? Like your project in Georgia, right? Where here's a problem, government's got problems, finding the right partners to bring that solution and take a risk. There's no guarantee that, there wasn't a commercial off the shelf. Hey, we're going to bring the right partners and try to make this thing work and see how it plays out and then extend it in subsequent phases. I think that's where the future really holds out. Again, it loops back to our whole conversation on collaboration. And it's really about no one party's going to solve this. Intel couldn't itself couldn't raise enough money to build out the Arizona factory. Now they've got the Ohio facility that they're going to be, building out, et cetera, to reestablish really a stronghold in U.S.-based manufacturing, as an example. And they're also talking to do one in Europe, right? So, but it's public-private partnerships. It's not just Intel. It's these other partners coming together. As we wrap up, I've got one question I always ask as we wrap up the end is what innovation, technology, are you most excited about that is coming? Not here today, something that you think is going to come. What is it that you think the listeners of this show should keep an eye on? What's coming that you are most excited about?
Boy, that is such a tough one. I'm going to grab something that's going to seem really outside the box that we've been talking about for decades. It's interesting to see all the advancements with electric vehicles, and I'm doing some work, a little bit of work around that too. But frankly, we still need trainloads of coal to run electrical plants and other fossil fuels, to power all those things. And people seem to forget about it. So it does help a little bit with pollution, but it's really not the smartest answer long term. And I'm still waiting for hydrogen fuel technologies to catch up. Because your waste from that product, we have infinite supply of hydrogen, and the waste product's water. And you've seen a variety of experiments. It'll require a massive infrastructure. But I really think that's something in the long term. Because the other thing is, Phil, what's the weakness of everything we do for decades? It's the battery. And the physics of the battery only evolves at a certain rate. And we're all get beat up by relatives. And why doesn't my battery last longer? The hydrogen thing, I think, is really interesting. And I'm not an expert on it, but I like the concept.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I don't know if you recall, we did a hydrogen fuel cell powered iPac mobile phone as an experiment at HP Labs, and it worked amazingly well. The problem is the water is the byproduct. Water and electronics, all in a single case, not a good mix of challenges, right? You're trying to replace the core battery on some of those things, but that's all been working on. That's got to be 15 years ago, that experiment. And I think you're right. I think, and actually, I have to give you credit. From all the guests I've had on the show, nobody has brought up the hydrogen fuel cell. Because I think in some cases, people have kind of written it off a little bit as on the practicality piece. But I think I'm with you. I think, we've got to find something that is not supply constraint, is not toxic, is something that is effectively if limitless from a renewability standpoint, and get out of continuing down our paths on some of the power situation. So,
well, I would remind our listeners that cellular phone technology was really designed in the mid '40s among other people, by Hedy Lamarr, and the first commercial call in '79, and now we're only at 80% plus smartphone penetration in the U.S. So. These things never come out fully baked, and it's a million small innovations over decades, and all of a sudden you got magic.
Exactly. Alan, thank you for the time. Appreciate great insights, and I'm sure the listeners got a lot out of it. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Phil.
So what did you think about Alan's prediction or Alan's thoughts on the technology innovation that he's most excited about? Hydrogen as an energy source to replace what we today are the technologies that are actually feed our electric grid so that we feel good about the electric car vehicles is still a challenge. A lot of that is still oil. It is still coal. But we need to be continuing to invest in these kinds of energy technologies. Hydrogen, I think, is very, very interesting. I've experimented with it in consumer electronics devices as part of some early testing. Still needs some work. So if you are working on a technology to create truly a limitless source of power, I would love to hear about it. I think that is a game changer. And it's an area that we need to continue to invest in, given our shift to away from fossil fuels in order to drive everything from transportation to how we live and how we operate. So hopefully you're as excited about hydrogen or whatever it is you are working on that is that next generation of limitless power. That, I think, is a game changer. With that, let's wrap up today's show. I know we went a little long. We got into the conversation. I appreciate you for hanging in there to this point. Thank you very, very much. Again, please share, tell others about the show, help us expand the people that are familiar with it. Any information that we shared in today's episode, you can find over in the show notes over at killerinnovations.com. You can find me on all the social medias as Phil McKinney, no spaces, all one word, on all the different social media platforms. And with that, thank you again. Stay tuned. We'll be right back here at the next episode. And in the meantime, continue to work on that idea and go change the world. Bye-bye.
Podcasting nonstop since 2005, this has been the Killer Innovation Show on the Innovators Network.
This show is distributed by the Innovators Network. For more information and other great shows and content, visit theinnovators.network.